negotiate with China as a country.
America is afraid of Traore. But why exactly? They're not scared of his army. They're afraid of his ideas. In Washington, they monitor his speeches. In Paris, they fear his alliances. But why exactly is Ibrahim Traoré so important for the West? For decades, the United States has mastered one game in Africa: control without chaos. Not through direct rule, but through a calibrated system. Aid, debt, military training, election support, and friendly handshakes in carefully staged summits. It's been the invisible leash, and it worked, until now. Because Ibrahim Traoré didn't just tug on that leash, he snapped it. Washington's model has always relied on predictable patterns. When a country faces instability, the US steps in with security cooperation. When an economy fails, the IMF delivers loans that guarantee Western financial oversight. When governments are too independent, civil society groups funded by Western donors quietly shift the political tide. But Traoré came to power and refused all of it. He didn't just reject a loan, he rejected the entire system. He didn't just ask the West to leave, he questioned why they were there in the first place. And in doing so, he exposed something that terrifies every power in Washington. The script doesn't work anymore. In Burkina Faso for years, American and French forces trained soldiers, ran counterinsurgency operations, and kept stability through proxy relationships. On paper, it looked like a partnership. In practice, it was strategic babysitting, preventing countries like Burkina Faso from turning toward any direction the West hadn't already approved. So imagine the shock in Washington when Traoré took power and did the opposite of what every diplomat expected. He didn't beg for support. He warned Western embassies to stay out of domestic affairs. He didn't sit down for carefully worded interviews. He went straight to the people with unfiltered speeches that bypassed the Western press altogether. He didn't just change policies, he changed the logic of leadership. That's not rebellion, that's a new template. One that ignores the carefully crafted expectations of acceptable African leadership and operates on a vision where Burkina Faso answers only to itself. This is where the real fear begins. Because the US is not simply watching a strong man consolidate power, it's watching a new philosophy form in real time. And it's a philosophy that, if it spreads, could burn through the Western order like dry grass in the Sahel. You see, Traoré's rejection of the West is not just political, it's symbolic. When he said, "We don't want to be a colony that pretends to be independent," he wasn't just talking about Burkina Faso. He was speaking to an entire continent of young people who feel trapped between poverty and foreign interference. And Washington knows it. They know that in Mali, Niger, Guinea, Chad, even in parts of Nigeria, this sentiment is growing. The old tools of control no longer generate silence. Instead, they trigger outrage. Every time a Western official lectures about governance, people remember Libya. Every time aid is offered, people ask why their gold is in Switzerland. Traoré didn't invent these questions. He just gave them a voice. And that voice is growing louder. Even more dangerous? He's not shouting it through think tanks or foreign panels. He's saying it in military parades, on dusty roads, in soldier camps, and online spaces where young Africans are creating their heroes. And let's be clear, this is not the image of an isolated autocrat. Traoré is forming a coalition, not of governments, but of generations. The youth calls him Le Capitaine. The streets rally not just behind his policies, but behind his defiance. He represents something the US foreign policy machine hasn't planned for: popular legitimacy outside its system. If you can't buy it, if you can't sanction it, if you can't isolate it, how do you stop it? Washington doesn't have an answer, because every traditional method, economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, media narratives, seems to only strengthen his position. The more they try to discredit him, the more credible he becomes in the eyes of his people. Traoré isn't just resisting the West, he's turning every Western attack into a rallying cry. This is why analysts and policymakers in the US aren't just watching Burkina Faso, they're watching the pattern. They're watching to see if others copy it. And they should be worried because they already are. From Mali's anti-French protests to Niger's break with the West, the signs are everywhere. And at the center of it all is a man who doesn't raise his voice, but raises expectations for what an African leader can be without Western approval. So yes, the fear is real. Because for the first time in decades, the United States is losing not just a client state, but control of the script. And the man rewriting it? He's just getting started. But can they do anything about Traore? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. If Washington feared the man alone, they might have ignored him. But Traore's danger lies not in his isolation. It lies in his multiplication. Because what began as a rebellion in Burkina Faso is becoming something else. A movement without borders, leaders, or breaks. You can silence guns, you can ban political parties, you can pressure governments, but you can't kill an idea once it's escaped the palace and landed in the street. And that's exactly what's happened with Traore's rise. He is no longer just a transitional president of a small West African country. He is now a living metaphor for resistance, a symbol, a warning, a blueprint. Across the continent, from Mali to Congo, from Senegal to Ethiopia, young Africans are watching Traore not as a politician, but as proof. Proof that an African leader can tell France to leave and not collapse. Proof that a president can refuse IMF loans and still build infrastructure. Proof that loyalty to the continent is more powerful than loyalty to old alliances. This is where Washington's anxiety transforms into fear. Because US influence doesn't depend on controlling every government, it depends on controlling the narrative. For decades, America sold the image of leadership. The suit, the scripted English, the World Economic Forum smile, the pro-Western agenda dressed as reform. And it worked, until Traore walked on stage in camouflage and spoke the language of his people instead. He doesn't go viral for giving polished speeches. He goes viral for standing in a crowd of soldiers and saying, "We are ready to die for this land." He doesn't tend to attend UN galas. He tends to reject foreign troops and build his defense coalition with other African nations. And that's the wildfire. Because the youth, the true population majority across Africa, are now asking questions their parents were too scared to ask. If Burkina Faso doesn't need France, why does Senegal? If Traore can create a bank without the World Bank, why can't Ghana? If he can speak freely without fear of sanctions, why are our leaders always apologizing? This wave of questioning is what the US State Department can't touch. It's not in the newspapers. It's on WhatsApp threads, in student unions, in motorcycle taxis, in YouTube comment sections, and in rap lyrics. It's not a policy, it's culture. And once culture shifts, policy follows. And the empires built on silence begin to crack. Traore isn't exporting ideology the way the Soviets or Americans once did. He doesn't need to. In an age where a clip from Ouagadougou can reach a slum in Nairobi in seconds, he just lives his truth. And others follow. In response, Western media have tried to frame him as dangerous, impulsive, and too militant. But those labels are falling flat. Because what people see isn't a man chasing war. It's a man who refused to let his country die slowly just to appear civilized. In many eyes, that makes him more legitimate than any Western-backed Democrat who presides over poverty and corruption with polite English and a clean tie. And now, the fear has spread beyond West Africa. In southern Africa, political activists are using Traore's name to demand land reform. In East Africa, youth movements speak of doing it the Traore way. Even in North Africa, where Western alliances run deeper, murmurs of admiration can be heard in the halls of universities and among military cadets. But here's what turns Western fear into full-blown panic. The people supporting Traore aren't just angry, they're organized. AES, the Alliance of Sahel States, isn't just a political bloc. It's an infrastructure for future rebellion. A skeleton for an African NATO without Western oversight. It includes joint defense, shared intelligence, resource protection, and soon, possibly, a new currency. Imagine if this spreads. Imagine a North African country joining AES. Imagine Angola offering trade deals in solidarity. Imagine the African Union, once a forum of Western-aligned politeness, being forced to acknowledge that a new power structure is rising, and it doesn't need Europe or America. This is the real threat. Unlike past waves of resistance, this one is not about replacing one puppet with another. It's about burning the stage and building a new one from scratch. And if that happens, every Western embassy from Abuja to Nairobi will have to answer one question they've dodged for decades. What happens when Africa stops listening? Traore's leadership has made that question impossible to ignore. He's not just standing tall, he's showing others how to stand. He's teaching by example. And in doing so, he's launching a revolution far more dangerous than any military coup. Because bullets can be blocked. But once an idea crosses a border, you can't stop it. Now the question is, has West been successful in stopping or even scaring Traore? On the 8th of May 2025, it became clear how less Western threats have scared Traore. When Ibrahim Traoré landed in Moscow on May 8, 2025, it wasn't for diplomacy. It wasn't a symbolic visit. It was a statement, and every Western capital heard it like a bomb blast. Not many African leaders get invited to stand beside Vladimir Putin during Russia's sacred Victory Day parade. But Traoré did. And he wasn't wearing a suit. He wasn't holding a paper speech. He walked calmly in his military uniform, shoulders squared, face unshaken, a soldier among global generals. Cameras rolled, analysts panicked, because this wasn't just a handshake. This was a realignment. For over 6 decades, Africa's global partnerships have been dictated by colonial leftovers and Cold War calculations. The US controlled influence through funding and bases. France controlled it through language, currency, and military muscle. And together, they ensured no African country got too close to anyone they didn't approve of. But Traoré's visit to Moscow shattered that firewall. What terrifies Washington is not the visit itself. It's what came with it. Military cooperation, for one. Weapons, training, and perhaps more importantly, intelligence sharing. Not just from Russia to Burkina Faso, but about the West. Burkina Faso has now become a strategic node where Russian influence meets the Sahel. It's a chess piece that was once under NATO's indirect watch. Now it's leaning east. But there's more. Burkina Faso under Traoré is not just securing arms, it's securing alternatives. Russia doesn't offer loans with strings like the IMF. It offers energy deals, agricultural trade, and defense infrastructure, all of which Traoré sees as tools to build African self-reliance, without foreign humiliation. Western policymakers are used to African leaders who flirt with Moscow or Beijing just to get better deals from the West. But Traoré isn't negotiating, he's exiting. He's not looking for leverage, he's looking for liberation. And that difference is what triggers full-scale panic inside Western war rooms. His alliance with Russia also signals something even darker for Washington. He's not afraid of Western retaliation. Historically, defiance was punished. Gaddafi was bombed, Sankara was betrayed, Lumumba was silenced. But Traoré? He's daring the West to try, in full view of an audience that now knows the old tricks. He doesn't fear sanctions because his economy isn't built around the West. He doesn't fear diplomatic isolation because he's already building a new world of allies. And that's where the bigger threat lies. He's not alone. Mali and Niger are already with him. Russia's presence in Africa is growing, not shrinking. China watches silently but approvingly. Iran and Turkey have both made indirect overtures. The BRICS alliance, once a sideshow, now feels like a gravitational center for leaders like Traoré who want to operate outside the dollar system, outside the IMF, outside the colonial axis of influence. Even more dangerously for the US, Traoré is thinking like a coalition builder. He doesn't want Burkina Faso to just survive. He wants it to lead. That's why the creation of the AES Alliance of Sahel States is structured more like a military pact than a diplomatic forum. Joint drills, shared intelligence, integrated economies, and possibly a shared digital currency not backed by Paris, but by African gold. And speaking of gold, there's another card Traoré is playing that has the West shaking. Burkina Faso's gold reserves are vast, and Traoré's government has made it clear they're not going to be stored in Swiss banks, counted by foreign accountants, or used to back Western-controlled currencies. They're going to back African independence. That terrifies Washington, which understands fully well that if African countries start linking their currencies to resources instead of dollars, the economic balance of power globally could begin to tilt. This isn't theoretical. Russia and China are already in early talks with African partners about non-dollar trade zones. Imagine an AES-backed currency accepted in BRICS corridors, for grain, fertilizer, tech, energy. That's a direct attack on US dollar supremacy without a single shot fired. Western media calls this pivoting away, but insiders know it's much more than that. It's cutting the cord, quietly, strategically, and permanently. That's why US officials and European diplomats are not just monitoring Traore. They're gaming out scenarios: how to contain the spread, how to prevent other leaders from following, how to undermine him without turning him into a martyr. But it may be too late, because what Traore just did in Moscow is irreversible. He declared not in words but in actions that Burkina Faso is no longer a client state. It's a sovereign actor. And that shift is impossible to undo without breaking the entire Western illusion of control. Traore has already shown he doesn't need validation from Washington. He doesn't need the old system. He's standing on a different stage now, one built in Russian steel, funded in African gold, and fueled by the rage of a generation. And in that alliance, the United States sees something it cannot bomb, bribe, or bully: a future where it no longer matters. The West will still try to fight Traore and try to control Africa again. And control doesn't begin with weapons, it begins with stories. And for decades, the West mastered the story of Africa, a helpless continent, plagued by corruption and chaos, needing guidance from enlightened democracies. The media pushed it, the NGOs packaged it, the diplomats delivered it with smiles. It was never true, but it was convincing. Because the people who could challenge it either died, were silenced, or were funded into obedience. Then came Ibrahim Traoré. Unlike other rebels, he didn't just reject Western military presence or financial interference. He began targeting the narrative itself. And for Washington, that's a red line far more dangerous than any Russian alliance. Because when you destroy the story that justifies the system collapses from within. Traoré's leadership isn't just military or political. It's psychological warfare against a narrative that has held Africa in place for half a century. A narrative where foreign aid is always generous, Western troops are always peacekeepers, elections equal freedom, democracy is a one-size-fits-all solution, African independence is real, as long as it doesn't challenge foreign interests. He's exposing each of those as colonial illusions wrapped in modern branding. Start with the media. When Western outlets began calling him a militant, a strongman, and another dictator in fatigues, Traoré didn't beg for better coverage. He called them out. Not once, but repeatedly. In speeches, he mocked their bias. On national television, he aired footage of Western coups, bombings, and hypocrisies. In schools, he pushed education programs based on African history, not colonial interpretations. And in public campaigns, he funded independent African media to tell the continent's stories without Western filters. The West fears that more than his army, because in a world of smartphones and satellites, media is a weapon, and for the first time, they're losing control of it. What happens when young Africans see France not as a friend, but as the architect of exploitation? What happens when the US counterinsurgency is seen as code for military occupation? What happens when the IMF is no longer a savior, but a debt-trap cartel? What happens is this: people stop listening. People start questioning. People like Traoré become heroes, not despite Western criticism, but because of it. Even worse for Washington, Traoré doesn't care to be liked. He's not managing PR, he's building pride. And that shift is dangerous because it undermines the last great stronghold of Western dominance: psychological consent. For decades, African elites were trained in Europe, educated to believe that progress meant aligning with Western values. They were taught that power came from foreign investment, that success meant being invited to Davos or clapping politely at UN panels. Traoré burned that playbook. He doesn't attend cocktail diplomacy. He doesn't wear expensive suits. He doesn't tailor his soldiers or youth, but across bureaucrats, artists, students, even ex-diplomats who now feel free to say what they never could under the weight of donor conditionality. And let's be clear, this isn't just Burkina Faso's internal shift, it's continental and global. Every time Traoré gives a speech rejecting foreign interference, it trends in Kenya. Every time he launches a domestic agriculture initiative without foreign grants, it's covered in Senegal. Foreign interests, Traoré is not just rewriting policy, he's killing the script. and without a script, the actors falter. Do you think the Western manipulation will finally end? Let us know in the comments section. Will they be able to stop Traore? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.